I'd like to ask you what you think about that, and if you don't want to comment, what message do you think you're sending?
We all watch in horror and consternation what's going on in the United States.
It felt longer that time, but it was a 21-second pause where the Prime Minister chose not to condemn the U.S. President specifically in his handling of the protests against police brutality and anti-Black racism. So what does his response, or perhaps more importantly in this instance, his silence tell us? It's Thursday, and I'm here with At Issue. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, ElDias Raj, and my Party Lines co-host, Elamine Abdelmahmoud. This allows us to promo the podcast as well, Elamine. Thank you all for being here. So there's been a lot of talk, obviously, about that pause, whether it was real, whether it was planned, how we should interpret it. So I just want to go around the horn and see what everyone thought of it. I'll start with you, Chantal.
Oh, thank you. I didn't think it was planned. How can you plan a 21-second pause? Looking the way you look, thinking your way through. I thought the question had an interesting curve in it, which may explain how long the pause was. I'm sure that Justin Trudeau and many of us would have felt better if he'd come out swinging. I'm not so sure that once he would have done that, we would all have felt that anything much was accomplished. So that's where I am.
Elamine, I'll go to you now. What do you think? Why do you think he answered in that way, or let that silence sort of be part of the answer?
I mean, to me, it was going to be a mystery no matter what he was going to say, because it's not like he can really take the high ground in this. It's not like people have forgotten about the blackface incident. It's not like people have forgotten about the fact that, they rolled out this massive anti-racism strategy, but then they forgot to, double the funding that they said they were going to do. So there's not a lot of points that he can kind of drive home as different. So I think, going quiet was searching, struggling for an answer, and it kind of makes sense. It kind of showed.
And Andrew, all the people demanding that the Prime Minister call out Donald Trump and condemn him directly, what should they have expected, other than something that was more about Canada and about us rather than something about him?
In which case he would have been criticized for showboating and playing to the domestic audience, and perhaps with some justice. I do think you have to pick your spots, particularly when you are in government as opposed to, let's say, an opposition MP. And you have to ask yourself at all times what's going to be accomplished by this. He did speak on the broader issue of racism in policing and more generally. I think he would have certainly been remiss, even allowing for some of his own blind spots on that. He would have been remiss if he didn't. But the specific criticism of Trump, knowing how mercurial, to use one word, he is, I think you have to ask yourself what's going to be accomplished here. It's not as if other people aren't denouncing Trump. If you were dealing with a situation where we weren't dealing with a democracy, for example, where if we in the broader community outside of that country don't talk about it, nobody will, that would be one thing. But this is something where people are certainly denouncing Trump enough. And I do think if you're in a position of leadership, you got to ask yourself, what's going to be accomplished by this, and is it going to be a net gain for the country?
Yeah, and when my colleague Tom Perry asked that question, because it was my CBC Radio colleague Tom who did ask that question, I mean, I think he was wondering whether this would be an instance where the Prime Minister would change his strategy in dealing with the President, ElDias. I guess that was what sort of drove the question.
It was a very good question, and it was good that there was a bit of a curveball in it. But I think a lot of people, including in Liberal circles, believe that the Prime Minister has a penchant for the dramatic and that this was a planned response. The Prime Minister's office official answer is that the Prime Minister was thinking about his answer and then gave it. And today he was asked about that a little bit, and he said that basically he takes his responsibility to Canadians seriously. And I think we can't forget what happened at the G7 in 2018, where the Prime Minister just had a regular press conference where in the background being the tariffs on steel and aluminum, and he said it was a bit insulting that Canada had been lumped in with other countries. And then all hell broke loose, and the President unleashed and started threatening auto tariffs. and killing basically the auto industry in this country. And so I think that there is a certain let's walk on eggshells when it comes to Donald Trump, because nobody knows what the president is going to do.
But go ahead, Chantal, yeah.
But beyond the walking on eggshells, and to go back to Andrew's point, do you really want to provide a distraction and an easy target for a president who is being hit by people inside his own country who are much more serious and a much more serious threat to his strategy than Justin Trudeau would ever be? There are times when it's nice not to stand in the way of a good fight. And in this instance, the silence did whatever it did. I figure we're probably spending too much time on it and not enough time on reality. But it did not take us into a fight that I think Trump would be happy to have.
It did, though, offer an opportunity to do something that other political leaders in Canada have said would have been needed, and that's Jagmeet Singh, the first person of color who leads a federal party. I want to play a clip of him.
The silence is deafening. The Prime Minister of Canada has to call out the hatred and racism happening just south of the border. And if the Prime Minister can't do that, how can everyday people be expected to stand up?
I mean, obviously, when you're not in government, Elamine, it's easier to point out these things. But is there something to what Jagmeet Singh is saying, too?
Certainly, tonally, there is. You know, like, I understand that the Prime Minister would go on the next day and say that part of the pause is that he has a responsibility to Canadians, but he also has a responsibility to, when he sees something as egregious as what's happening in the U.S., kind of call it out and name it. And for him to sort of shy away from that, I think actually doesn't fit with the image that he's trying to build for himself. Like, that was sort of a really easily missed shot, because I think he spent a lot of time trying to be, you know, the guy who will take on those answers. And in that moment, he just completely went quiet.
And he was sort of slapped around a bit today, Andrew Coyne, by Al Sharpton too, who said, you know, I'm not going to make you wait for my answer. But I wonder if there was a moment of leadership that he could have provided if he went a little further. He did say that we were horrified and there was an intense consternation. But I wonder if there was a moment there that he missed.
Well, he did speak, as I understand it, to the broader issue of,
yes,
as I say, racism and policing and racism more generally. And he also took care to turn and he took flack for this, to say that we cannot lecture from too high a horse in Canada, maybe a slightly higher horse than the United States, but we have our own problems with that here. And some people took him to task for that. I thought it was entirely appropriate. I think this was a point that a lot of people were making, was that this is a far broader problem than people want to admit. So I'd like to be able to dump on him on this, but I really don't.
Last word to you, ElDias.
I think Green Party leader, actually she's no longer the Green Party leader, Green Party parliamentary leader Elizabeth May probably said it best when she recognized this week that she has a role to play when she was speaking about herself and Jagmeet Singh condemning what we were seeing in the United States by the president, but that the Prime Minister has a role to play as well, and that everybody knows each other's responsibility, and she was going to shy away from criticism of Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland because she recognizes that they're dealing with the unpredictable. And frankly, I think what is more concerning this week is that the Prime Minister would not denounce what he saw in the video in Nunavut with the Inuk man who was clearly struck by a truck and 5 RCMPs pinned him to the ground, that he is refusing to come out with a national action plan, the 231 call to actions from the inquiry on missing women and girls.
He's delaying, he's not refusing.
He's delaying it, yeah, they say it's because of the pandemic. But there are things that would be pretty easy announcements. There could be a national ombudsman for Indigenous and human rights issues. I mean, that's a pretty easy thing to strike up. You know, there are a lot of things here domestically where, you know, when you listen to Alan Sharpton, somebody mentioned him, when he was talking about people being unable to fulfill their full potential because somebody has their foot on their neck. Well, you could use that not just Black Canadians in this country, but especially Indigenous Canadians in this country. There are grievances here that Justin Trudeau has been surprisingly silent on this week.
Even as some of our allies, including the United States, seem to withdraw from the world, Canada is engaging in strong and confident ways, as Canadians expect us to.
The United States' role on the global stage has changed over the past few years, as has its relationship with Canada, but a lot actually just over the past few months. Where do things stand between the two now? Chantal, Andrew, ElDias, and Elamine, all back for another round of At Issue. I'll admit here that we sort of stole this notion from Aaron Weary's column about the relationship and it changing. But when you hear the Prime Minister, and I'll start with you, Andrew, talking about how the United States has stepped back and presumably looking for ways for Canada to step in as sort of a middle power, is there any possibility our relationship gets better or changes more dramatically?
Not until after Trump is gone, certainly. That is the biggest source of abnormality in the whole situation. The question is, after he's gone, what replaces him? Let's assume they lose in the election in November. Some of the American position that prior to Trump is never going to come back. They are not going to come back, I don't think, to the same kind of position of world leadership that they occupied before, partly because they don't want to, and partly because the rest of the world perhaps doesn't want them to. So there is going to be a new normal in that sense, in a multilateral sense. I'm not so sure that we can't reestablish a bilateral relationship in terms of our own continental affairs that isn't much more approximately close to what we had before. We have the NAFTA in place, or whatever you want to call it now. I think remains huge reservoirs of goodwill on both sides of the border. I don't see that being a huge alteration once Trump is gone. But that broader context of our place in the world, now that it's no longer going to be a Pax Americana, that's a bigger question.
Chantal, what do you think?
I've watched this relationship ebb and flow. When we declined to join the U.S. in Iraq, lots of people wrote about how things would never be the same, and then Barack Obama came around. And even with Stephen Harper in power, the relationship was fairly sound. So I tend to treat the Trump years, for however long they will be, as an anomaly. But before thinking that the world is going to shift in significant ways because the U.S. will not be taking on the leadership role that it had in the past, no matter what the result of the American election, I pause to think who then will, because Emmanuel Macron in France is an embattled leader. Brexit is still happening. Angela Merkel is at the end of her career. So, yeah, okay, fine. Like who?
That's a good point. ElDias.
To sound like an echo chamber here, I think that we all agree that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. Will outlast whoever the occupant of the White House is, and that things will probably recalibrate themselves come November if Joe Biden wins. And if Donald Trump continues on, then the Prime Minister has developed a functional relationship, and that will continue. What it means for our role on the international stage, I think it's still not clear exactly what role Canada wants to play. We're very good at lip service and talking about things that are important to us and that are values-based. But when it actually comes to deliverables or taking hard and tough decisions, we seem to shy away from making those decisions. So I don't know, time will tell.
Elamine.
As John Manley said, when the bill comes due, we excuse ourselves to go to the bathroom.
All right, Elamine, you have to try and top that as the last word.
But my curiosity is just like how long the pandemic keeps the borders closed, because I think that does change the calculus that we have. So, the longer that border stays closed, the longer that the relationship is at least like a little bit strained. And while we're trying to manage Donald Trump while he's in office, yeah, that's a problem. But if we go, 7-8 months with this border closed, I don't know if anyone's talking about that or not, then I think that does change our standing when it comes to the U.S.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you all. Appreciate you being here. Elamine, thanks for doing double duty this week, having to spend extra time with me. Appreciate it. We'll see the rest of you next week. And before we go, be sure to check out the Party Lines podcast. That's where you can find Elamine and I every week. This week, we talk about that debate around defunding the police. Catch that conversation on any major podcast app.